What if the difference between you and a millionaire is not the number in their bank account, but the number of times per day their brain makes a different kind of decision than yours does? Because here is what the research actually shows. Here is what the biographies and the longitudinal studies and the behavioral psychology literature all converge on. When you strip away the mythology, the highlight reels, the Instagram aesthetics of private jets and morning routines filmed in perfect lighting, millionaires are not a different species. They do not have access to a secret body of knowledge that has been withheld from everyone else. They were not all born into privilege or handed a head start that made their success inevitable. And the vast majority of them, study after study confirms this, built their wealth not through a single dramatic moment of genius or luck, but through the quiet, consistent, psychologically sophisticated repetition of specific daily habits that most people either don't know about, don't take seriously enough to actually implement, or abandon the moment those habits become inconvenient, which is precisely the moment they would have begun to compound. And today, we are going to go deep, not into the surface level, listicle version of millionaire habits that you have already seen 100 times, but into the actual psychology, the actual neuroscience, the actual behavioral architecture underneath those habits. Because knowing what millionaires do is almost useless without understanding why those specific behaviors produce the specific psychological and financial outcomes they produce. And once you understand the why, the what becomes not just more compelling, but genuinely, practically, immediately actionable in your own life, regardless of where you are starting from. Let's begin with the habit that underlies every other habit on this list. And that is the habit of radical financial consciousness, which sounds abstract until you understand what it actually means at the behavioral level. The vast majority of people relate to money the way they relate to the weather, as something that happens to them, something that arrives and departs according to forces largely outside their understanding and control, something to be reacted to rather than managed, something to hope about rather than plan for. Millionaires, by overwhelming statistical consensus across every serious study of high net worth individuals ever conducted, from Thomas Stanley's landmark research in The Millionaire Next Door, to the ongoing behavioral economics research at institutions like Harvard and the London School of Economics, relate to money as a system, as a set of flows and forces that can be understood, measured, optimized, and directed with precision. They know their numbers, not approximately, precisely. They know their monthly income and their monthly expenses. They know their net worth and they review it regularly. They know their investment returns and their debt costs and the spread between the two. They know where every significant dollar went last month and where every significant dollar is intended to go next month. And this is not the behavior of people who love spreadsheets. It is the behavior of people who have internalized a fundamental psychological truth that most people never confront, which is that you cannot manage what you do not measure, and you cannot grow what you do not understand. And the first and most foundational habit of every person who has ever built genuine wealth is the habit of looking clearly, honestly, regularly, and without the emotional avoidance that keeps most people financially unconscious their entire lives. Now, let's go into the habit that most people recognize as the most famous millionaire behavior, but almost nobody implements with the psychological sophistication required to make it actually work. And that is the habit of early rising. Now, before your eyes glaze over, because you've heard this 1,000 times, stay with me, because the research on why early rising correlates with financial success is far more psychologically interesting than the motivational poster version suggests. It is not simply that the early hours are magical, or that the universe rewards those who see the sunrise, or any of the other romantic narratives that surround this habit. The actual psychological mechanism is this: decision quality degrades across the day as cognitive resources are depleted through social interaction, emotional management, reactive problem solving, and the continuous low-level cognitive tax of navigating an information-saturated modern environment. The person who wakes early and uses those first hours before the demands of the external world begin their relentless encroachment for their highest priority, most cognitively demanding, most strategically important work is essentially making their most important decisions and doing their most important thinking with a full tank of cognitive fuel, while their competition is doing theirs on fumes at the end of an exhausting day. Neuroscience research confirms that the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, long-term planning, creative problem solving, and the kind of strategic thinking that generates wealth, is at its functional peak in the hours immediately following deep sleep, before it has been depleted by the decision fatigue and emotional load of daily life. Millionaires do not rise early because they are masochists or because they have internalized some Protestant work ethic about the virtue of suffering. They rise early because they have discovered, through experience or deliberate design, that those morning hours are the most cognitively valuable real estate in their entire day, and they protect and invest those hours with the same intentionality that they apply to their financial capital. The third habit, and this one is so consistently documented across millionaire biographies and behavioral research that it would be irresponsible to skip it, even though it sounds almost painfully obvious, is the habit of reading, specifically reading nonfiction, specifically reading in the domains of finance, psychology, biography, history, and strategic thinking, specifically at volumes and with a consistency that the average person does not come close to matching. Tom Corley's 5-year study of the daily habits of wealthy versus poor individuals found that 88% of wealthy people read for self-improvement for 30 minutes or more each day, compared to 2% of poor people. A difference so dramatic that it demands psychological explanation rather than mere observation. The explanation is this: reading, particularly nonfiction reading in domains relevant to wealth creation, is the most time-efficient method ever devised for acquiring the mental models, the cognitive frameworks, the historical pattern recognition, and the vicarious experiential learning that allow a person to make better decisions across every domain of their financial life. When you read the biography of a great entrepreneur or investor, your brain does not just receive information, it constructs a mental simulation of the decision-making environment that person navigated, which builds neural pathways for similar decision-making in your own life. When you study behavioral economics, you acquire the ability to recognize and correct for the cognitive biases that silently corrupt financial judgment. When you study financial history, you develop the long-term pattern recognition that allows you to make rational decisions in environments where most people are making emotional ones. Reading is not a hobby for millionaires. It is a competitive advantage, systematically and deliberately cultivated, and its compounding return on cognitive investment is one of the most reliable wealth-building mechanisms ever identified. Now, let's examine the habit that is perhaps the most psychologically complex and the most commonly misunderstood. And that is the millionaire's relationship with risk. Popular mythology paints wealthy people as bold, fearless risk takers who bet big and win through a combination of courage and charisma. The research tells a completely different story. Studies on entrepreneurial decision-making by psychologist Saras Sarasvati, whose research on expert entrepreneurs produced the concept of effectual reasoning, found that successful wealth builders are not characterized by a high tolerance for risk, but by a sophisticated ability to calculate, constrain, and transform risk, to understand precisely what they are risking, to limit their maximum downside to what they can genuinely afford to lose, and to structure their bets in ways that allow them to remain in the game regardless of the outcome of any single decision. This is the psychological habit of asymmetric thinking, seeking situations where the potential upside is significantly larger than the potential downside, where the worst possible outcome is survivable and the best possible outcome is transformative, and avoiding situations where the reverse is true, regardless of how exciting or compelling they appear. The poor person buys lottery tickets, maximum downside equivalent to maximum upside, pure chance, no skill premium. The millionaire buys undervalued assets, starts businesses with validated demand, invests in skills that compound, and structures every financial bet so that time, effort, or information gives them an edge that pure chance does not. The habit of asymmetric risk thinking is not innate. It is learned, usually through either a painful loss that burned the lesson into the neural architecture permanently, or through deliberate study of the decision frameworks of people who have built wealth successfully, which is yet another argument for the reading habit we discussed a moment ago. Let's now look at the habit that most distinguishes the psychology of millionaires from the psychology of people who remain financially average. And that is the habit of investing in assets rather than consuming liabilities. Robert Kiyosaki's framework, though simplified, points at a genuinely important psychological distinction. The wealthy habitually direct surplus income toward things that produce more income: stocks, real estate, businesses, intellectual property, skills, while the financially average habitually directs surplus income toward things that consume income: depreciating consumer goods, status symbols, experiences that are pleasant but not compounding. And the psychological mechanism that drives this distinction is not greed or financial sophistication in the narrow sense. It is a fundamentally different relationship with delayed gratification, which neuroscience research links directly to the functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. People who have developed stronger prefrontal cortex governance over immediate impulses, through habit, through environment design, through the kind of long-term thinking that reading and mentorship and financial education cultivate, find it neurologically easier to forego the immediate consumption reward in favor of the delayed but compounding investment reward. And the habit of consistently making that choice, of looking at surplus income and asking, what can this money produce, rather than what can this money buy, is the behavioral expression of a brain that has been trained through repeated practice to value future wealth over present pleasure, which is the neurological prerequisite for every form of compounding that has ever produced financial freedom. Now, let's talk about the social habits of millionaires, because the research on high net worth individuals consistently reveals a set of social behaviors and relationship patterns that are distinctly different from the population average and that produce outsized financial returns through mechanisms that most people never examine. The first and most important of these social habits is what we might call intentional association, the deliberate, sometimes ruthless, curation of the social environment to maximize exposure to people who are operating at or above the level of thinking, ambition, and financial sophistication the person aspires to. This is not snobbery, it is neuroscience. Mirror neurons in the human brain cause us to unconsciously absorb and replicate the behavioral patterns, emotional states, and cognitive frameworks of the people we spend the most time with, which means that your social environment is not just emotionally influential, it is neurologically formative, literally shaping the neural pathways that govern your thinking, your risk tolerance, your financial beliefs, and your behavioral defaults. Millionaires tend to seek mentors aggressively and early, to join communities of ambitious peers deliberately, to attend events and environments where people who have built what they want to build are present and accessible, and to invest in relationships generously and with long time horizons, not transactionally, not what can this person do for me right now, but with the understanding that the compounding return on genuine human relationships is one of the highest yield investments available to any person at any financial level. The second social habit, and this one surprises most people, is that successful wealth builders are, by strong statistical consensus, extraordinarily generous, and their generosity precedes rather than follows their wealth. Research by organizational psychologist Adam Grant at Wharton Business School demonstrates that givers, people who contribute to others without immediate expectation of return, outperform takers and matchers across virtually every domain of professional success studied, because generosity builds the kind of trust, reciprocity, and reputation that creates opportunities at a rate that no transactional relationship strategy can replicate. The millionaire habit of generosity is not altruism in opposition to financial interest. It is the psychologically sophisticated understanding that a reputation for genuine generosity is one of the most valuable and most durable competitive advantages a person can build in any professional or entrepreneurial domain. Now, let's examine the habit of health, because the correlation between physical health practices and financial success is one of the strongest and most consistently replicated relationships in all of behavioral research on high performance. And understanding why reveals something crucial about the psychology of sustained wealth creation. Exercise specifically produces a cascade of neurological effects that are directly relevant to the cognitive demands of wealth building. It increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which promotes the growth of new neurons and enhances the brain's capacity for learning and memory consolidation. It reduces cortisol, the stress hormone whose chronically elevated presence in high-pressure financial environments impairs prefrontal cortex function, narrows cognitive flexibility, and produces the kind of reactive, short-term decision-making that is antithetical to wealth accumulation. It improves sleep quality, which is the most fundamental recovery mechanism available to the human brain and whose deprivation produces cognitive impairments equivalent to significant blood alcohol levels. And it builds what psychologists call self-regulatory strength, the demonstrated capacity to impose voluntary discomfort on yourself in service of a delayed benefit. which transfers directly to the self-regulatory demands of financial discipline. The millionaire who exercises every morning is not compartmentalizing their health from their wealth. They are literally building the brain they need to do the thinking that their financial life demands. And they understand this connection with a clarity that most people who think of exercise as vanity or indulgence simply do not have. Let's now look at what may be the most psychologically sophisticated habit in the entire millionaire behavioral repertoire. And that is the habit of continuous learning, not just through reading, but through deliberate, systematic skill acquisition in domains directly relevant to wealth creation. Economist Tyler Cowen's research on what he calls the average is over thesis. The idea that the modern economy produces increasingly extreme returns to those with rare and valuable skills, while producing stagnant or declining returns to those with common or replicable ones, points directly at the financial logic of continuous skill investment. The millionaire mindset approaches skill acquisition as an investment with a calculable return. What is the financial value of being in the top 10% of this skill combined with the top 10% of that skill? And what is the time cost of reaching that level? And is the return on that time investment greater than the return on alternative uses of the same time? This kind of explicit, quantified thinking about skill investment is almost entirely absent from the cognitive habits of financially average people, who tend to acquire skills reactively and opportunistically rather than strategically and proactively, and who tend to stop learning the moment they achieve functional competence rather than pursuing the mastery that produces the rare and valuable capabilities that the modern economy rewards most extravagantly. And now let's arrive at the final and most psychologically fundamental habit, the one that all the other habits in this video are expressions of, the one that, if genuinely developed, makes every other millionaire behavior not just possible, but inevitable. And that is the habit of long-term thinking applied not just to finances, but to every domain of life simultaneously. Daniel Kahneman's research on the two systems of human cognition, the fast, automatic, emotionally driven System 1 and the slow, deliberate, rationally governed System 2, reveals that the default human cognitive mode is short-term, reactive, and present biased, which is why most people make most financial decisions in ways they regret, and why behavioral economists find a consistent, massive, cross-cultural human tendency to overvalue present rewards and undervalue future ones by margins that bear no relationship to rational economic interest. Millionaires have not transcended this cognitive architecture, but they have built habits, environments, and decision-making systems that consistently activate System 2 thinking in the domains where it matters most, and that consistently extend their time horizon beyond the present moment into the future, where the consequences of today's choices will actually be lived. They ask not, "What do I want right now?" but "What does the person I intend to be in 10 years need me to do today?" And they have trained themselves through years of deliberate practice and often through painful experience to let that future-oriented question govern their behavior in the moments when the present-oriented brain is screaming for immediate comfort, immediate reward, and immediate relief from the discomfort of disciplined, patient, compounding-oriented action. And here is the final psychological truth that this entire video has been building toward. Every single habit we have discussed today is available to you right now, regardless of your current financial position, regardless of your educational background, regardless of the family you were born into or the circumstances you are navigating. Every one of these habits began, for every millionaire who practices them, as a single imperfect first attempt made by someone who was not yet the person those habits would eventually build. The early rising began with one alarm. The reading began with one book. The investing began with one small frightened deposit. The intentional association began with one uncomfortable introduction at one event the person almost didn't attend. The compounding did not begin when the results became visible. It began in the invisible, unremarkable, deeply ordinary moment when the habit was first chosen. Not because it felt natural or comfortable or certain to work, but because the person making the choice had decided at a level deep enough to govern their behavior rather than just their daydreams, that the life they were living was less important than the life they were capable of building, and that every habit they chose from that moment forward was either a vote for the version of themselves that would build it, or a vote for the version of themselves that would spend their life wishing they had. Subscribe for more